Hi, welcome to Social and Political Philosophy. My name is Mark Thorsby. In this course, we're reviewing a number of philosophical ideas within social and political philosophy. This week, we're going to be looking at George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's social philosophy. Now, Hegel's philosophy, just to sort of provide some context, is number one, very difficult to understand. It's very difficult to read. His language is very technical, and so many of you, before watching this video and having read the material, maybe just scratching your heads thinking, I just really don't understand what's happening in this. So what I want to do in this video is provide you with sort of a framework to understand what Hegel is doing, and ultimately articulate some of the key moments in Hegel's philosophy that I think are pretty important. Okay, so that's what I want to do in this video. Now, also to provide another element of context, remember Hegel here, last week we discussed Kropotkin's anarchism, and this week we're discussing Hegel's philosophy. Hegel is a critic of social contract theory again, and he not only offers a criticism of social contract theory, but his philosophy really helped launch a whole series of criticisms against social contract theory. So he's pretty influential in this regard. We'll see that you can't really even understand Karl Marx unless you understand Hegel. In fact, your book even mentions in the Hegel chapter that many people say that Marx is not so much as an original thing. I don't know if I disagree with that, but the idea there is that Marx really takes Hegel's philosophy and inverts it, flips it upside down. And then in that sense, Marx isn't quite as original as one might think. But anyway, we'll sort of hold off on our criticism and discussion of Marx. So let me start off by giving you something of a philosophical abstract. The first thing there's lots of ways to approach Hegel here, but the first thing I want to refer to as is that Hegel is a key philosopher of history. And we'll see that historical thinking is pivotal to understanding Hegel's actually philosophical project here. Hegel begins, in fact, in his introduction to the philosophy of history, which was actually a text he used for his introduction to philosophy of history students. Hegel articulates that when we think of history, there's a problem, and the problem is that history is a bloodbath, right? Let's consider it for a moment. It looks like when you look back in history, you just see really just as a series of wars and a series of bloodshed and violence. And peace only sort of momentarily, briefly interrupts that sort of train, that procession of blood, right? He calls it a slaughter bench, right? And so the question is, can we make sense of history? And that is, can we make sense of ourselves in the context of history? And furthermore, how can we make sense of society and the state within this broader historical context? Now, the other concern, Hegel is a prominent sort of big name philosopher because he's also interested in solving lots of different problems. One of these critical problems in philosophy, it's actually a metaphysical problem, is the problem of being and becoming, right? When we say that something has being, what we mean to say, and again here I'm trying to give you my sort of take and my understanding on it, ultimately I think that Hegel's language here is very difficult and technical, so I'm not using Hegel's language here. But when we talk about the problem of being and becoming, being refers to the fact that something exists and that it has existence, right? And becoming refers to the idea that things are changing. Things are coming in and out of existence. Now, but there's a sort of fundamental problem, which is everything that exists exists. But if it exists, how is it the fact that things can go out of existence? Because we know that, or at least it stands to reason here, that things cannot come from nothing, right? That in order for something to come into existence, something has to already exist. So something doesn't come from nothing. But the problem, though, is that how is it that things which have existence go out of existence? And it looks like things, before they come into existence, somehow they do come from nothing. That is, how do we make sense of the idea that things have existence, they have being, and yet this being is in a state of flux? It's in a state of change. And in fact, if we're to talk about history, what we see is that history is about that problem, actually. History is a state of becoming, where things are going in and out of existence. And in fact, perhaps we can begin to understand the slaughter bench, the bloodletting of history, as a process of becoming towards something. And Hegel's idea, he's a fundamentally optimistic guy because he believes that history is progressive. In fact, many people before Hegel, I don't think that this notion that history is necessarily getting better, and which is a very American sort of ethos. This idea that history was progressive wasn't necessarily that well widely held. But Hegel does think that history is about progress. That is, ultimately, we can make sense of the bloodletting of history when we understand that it is a process towards the becoming of what? For Hegel now, there's a lot to talk about here, and there's no way I can do it all in this video, so I feel utterly inadequate here, right? But history is a dialectic. Now, the dialectic is a technical term, and I'll go over that here in just a moment, which is actually a way of explaining in more precise terms what it means for things to become and things to go into and out of existence, right? So history is a dialectic. And what is it a dialectic towards? It's a dialectic towards absolute consciousness. In fact, it's not just that. It's the dialectic of Geist. Now, Hegel's idea, he believed that history was proceeding and that through sort of various forms of existence, including and up to the existence of civil society and the state, that God, Geist, and that German Geist means spirit, the Geist was coming into existence, that God literally was coming into existence through the progressive consciousness of human beings and their social forms of existence. Okay, now there's a lot to sort of try to explain here and to fill in the pictures, but what I want you to sort of think is that Hegel's general picture here is that history is a process towards which God is coming into consciousness, or Geist, the spirit, absolute spirit, and that the bloodletting of history, these are just momentary though necessary moments towards the sublation or the slow evolution of consciousness. Now, that means that history is a dialectic. It's this movement towards consciousness, absolute consciousness in the final analysis. Now, the thing we'll see is that social institutions and consciousness play a pretty important role for Hegel, especially towards the end. He's going to argue that eventually that the state is just one sort of, is a sort of final process towards the slow evolution of consciousness. Now, but that means, though, that the state is not the result of a social contract, the way Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and these other thinkers argue. Because in their view, right, they have this sort of state of nature, and then we sort of, through mutual agreement or something, we come together and create society, etc. But that's contractual, and for Hegel, that's insufficient in an explanation, because it looks like what accompanies the state is a particular form of consciousness. In fact, perhaps we could even say that consciousness, the progress of consciousness, is what actually allows for the state. For instance, consider that there's been a lot of criticisms about the idea that the United States has a sort of social democratic project in which we want to promote democracy in all quadrants of the world, right, in all states, in sort of democratic social contractualism. But of course, it looks like there are certain places in the world where the sort of necessary civil infrastructure, the civil society, doesn't exist. And as long as that's the case, democracy or representative form of government can't work. A state cannot exist. Why? Think about it. Why is it that other people in the world don't just naturally, haven't already come to the conclusion of having a social contractual system, right? Think about the Islamists, for instance. Those are the people who are arguing and are fighting right now not to have a democratic state, but rather instead to have a sort of theocratic form of life, right? Now, why is that the case? That's because there's a link between social institutions and consciousness. And social contractualism only begins to exist after the Renaissance, because a certain form of consciousness became available in which that became a real option. So the idea here is that if you don't have the consciousness, you won't get the social institution, which means that it's not just about a state of nature, and it's not just about a mutual agreement, that it's actually about a process towards coming to self-realization about the world. And of course, in Hegel's broader project, it's about God's movement in this direction, okay? Now, that's a lot to sort of talk about, and it's kind of confusing, but I'm hoping that you can at least begin to sort of sketch out the bigger picture. Because as you're reading the text, it's very easy to sort of get lost in the details, as it were, and not to sort of understand what, it's easy to read and be like, what the heck is this guy talking about? How does this have to do with social democracy? What's the point? But hopefully this is giving you a broader narrative here and with which to contextualize your reading. Okay, now let me say a little bit about the dialectic. Now, the dialectic really is articulated, for instance, in a number of Hegel's texts, but in Hegel's Science of Logic. And it's a logical idea, right? The dialectic refers to the process by which the consciousness is in this state of becoming, right? Now, and I forgot to mention, at the very end of the day, right, Hegel thinks that you get absolute consciousness, so you get absolute freedom, right? So it's progress towards absolute freedom, which sounds great. But that means also that the state doesn't begin with freedom. So he has a different conception of freedom we'll get to. Now, but all of it hinges on understanding this concept of the dialectic. Now, this is, i.e., the process towards which, in fact, let's just put it in there, right? The dialectic equals the process for becoming. Okay, let's maybe move that around, right? And I think that's a way that we can understand what the dialectic is. Now, the simplest way to talk about the dialectic is to use this language of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. You'll notice, though, that Hegel doesn't use this language. At least he doesn't use it until very particular spots. But I think it's really important that we use this language, because this language will be very important for us to also understand Marx. And I think it's the easiest way to sort of conceptually grasp it. The idea here is that this is the dialectic for consciousness, right? Because I forgot to mention, Hegel's an idealist, so he thinks consciousness is what's directing the social instantiation the material instantiation of things. So, but think about it like this: history proceeds to a certain specific thesis. The thesis is a certain sort of idea. To put it in real vulgar layman's terms, think about the idea that every society always has a certain sort of paradigm. Okay, what is a paradigm? Let me actually throw that language in here for you, because I think it's helpful. Now, it's important because Hegel doesn't use this language, right? But what is a paradigm? A paradigm is something like the world view, a worldview, right? It is the way in which one understands the world and their place in the world. And within that paradigm are a whole host of assumptions about the way the world is and what the world should be, and so on and so forth. Now, those assumptions are given to us historically, right? We grow up in a society, in some sort of social arrangement, in which this paradigm is taught to us. These assumptions become naturally ingrained in us. A good sort of example here, a helpful example, is to think about the idea that before a man walked on the moon, right? The paradigm that existed was that it's just not possible to walk on the moon, right? The moon is in the heavens, and the heavens can't be reached. But you can see that now in our world, that paradigm has totally changed. That paradigm has shifted, right? Where now that is a world possibility, right? So that means that when we talk about a thesis, we're talking about a specific stage, right? within a larger overall historical process. Now, when we talk about the dialectic, the use of the term thesis here, for instance, is the use of the term thesis here is very formal, because we can be talking about consciousness here, or we could be talking about social historical events and processes. So this is very, very formulaic here, right? But let's use this language. So there's always a thesis. Now, the notion here is that every thesis, because it's in a state of becoming, has always within it some sort of internal contradiction. Actually, let's put that down here, right? So we could say here that what's included within these assumptions, somewhere within the thesis, is an internal contradiction. And the internal contradiction is within the idea, but it gets manifested through the material, right? And the idea here is that this thesis slowly develops an antithesis. That is, it develops its negation, right? Because ultimately the internal contradiction can't last, right? A sort of interesting example here is to think about the United States, right? And think about what's part of the thesis of the United States, right? If you will, part of the thesis of the United States is, go back to the Declaration of Independence, right? The Declaration of Independence was the idea that all men are created equal, right? Well, wait a second. It says that all men are created equal, and the whole point of creating the country was to create a system of equality, but was it equal? In fact, the very document that specifies this, the Constitution, is internally contradictory, right? It's a document meant to create a system where equality can be realized, and yet within the very pages of the Constitution, the original pages, include the idea that slavery is instituted by law, right, or it's protected by law, thus instituted. Right, so slavery is inherently contradictory, and even though there was this central idea of equality, through the sort of material that represented a certain form of consciousness, but the consciousness in its existent form in the world was contradictory. Right, you have these social institutions where people are literally chained up and don't have shoes and aren't fed well and are treated horribly, miserably. Right? The whole idea of creating freedom is based upon taking away freedom. And olden time is that socially this creates an antithesis eventually. And the antithesis can be seen, for instance, as perhaps the growing movement towards freeing the slaves, right? For some reason I'm losing the word I'm looking for, right? But then eventually the thesis and the antithesis here, right? Because the antithesis is the negation of the idea, that eventually these two things collide socially. And in terms of the notion of history, this is what he thinks is happening why there's so much bloodshed in history. Is because these social forces are colliding, and then ultimately through conflict and bloodshed, a new synthesis is born. Or he says there's a process of sublation, is actually the term he uses. Here, I'll put that on here for you. Sublation, right? Oh look, the thing doesn't, yeah, no, okay. It doesn't have it, I guess, because it's a technical term, right? But that this process exists where eventually the antithesis is sublated into a new synthesis or a new thesis. He calls this the notion. So as you're reading the text, you'll see he refers to the notion of consciousness. This is what he's talking about. Now, the synthesis, like the thesis, right, is effectively a new paradigmatic form, but it also has its own internal contradictions. And so you might say that sort of what happens here is that the thesis, well, really just gets turned into, the sublation here gets turned into a new thesis, which eventually develops another antithesis or negation, and so on and so forth. Hegel refers to this as the negation of negation, right? That there's the antithesis, and then the whole paradigm gets negated into the synthesis. Now, this is his overall way of understanding historical process, but it's a way of understanding the historical process of consciousness, and ultimately that has everything to do with the question of freedom in the state, okay? It's pretty technical stuff, but I'm hoping it makes some sense. let's see here, why isn't it going here? So let's move forward here. Now, I spent more time on this section really sort of laying out some of the technical aspects here. So hopefully you can start to see that. But you'll see that this video is really just an introductory, cursory video, right? Now, the sort of magnum opus of Hegel's is called the Phenomenology of Spirit. Oh, I don't have it here. And what I've had, this Phenomenology of Spirit sort of tells the story of this dialectical process of consciousness, beginning with just basic life, all the way up through human life, both animal life, human life, the various forms of social life, and the stages of social life, all the way up to the state and the emergence of Geist, right? Spirit here is the term Geist for Hegel, right? And the phenomenology is essentially the phenomena, the way we can describe the phenomena of this process of spirit. Now, one of the key points in this text is the master-slave dialectic, also called the master and bondsman discussion. And but the reason this is so important is because it really identifies the process of the dialectical stage for consciousness in a way which actually helps us understand what exactly is going on here in terms of the consciousness and its relationship to politics and society and so forth. Now, but here's a couple things that I want to sort of begin with, and these are I'm sort of just taking these directly extrapolated from the master-slave dialectic, from the Phenomenology of Spirit. But there's some really key critical points here that are very different, because if we begin by thinking about consciousness, that radically sort of alters the schema by which we're going to understand what the state is. Okay, so here's the first thing. Well, let's talk about self-consciousness. Now, by the way, this comes in the middle of the book, because he starts with consciousness, but one of the stages of consciousness is the development of self-consciousness, right? And what is self-consciousness? Normally when we think about self-consciousness, we think about the fact that we are able to understand ourselves, not just the world, right? So on the one hand, I could talk about animals having consciousness, right? For instance, when a bird flies down to a pond, it's obviously conscious of the world. The question, though, is it self-consciousness? Now, I don't really want to get into the discussion about animal self-consciousness, but I want you to see that there's a difference between just being conscious, that is, having some sort of awareness of the world, versus being conscious that one is a part of that world. Now, but here's the idea: self-consciousness for Hegel, for human beings here, exists only in terms of when we are acknowledged. That is, self-consciousness exists only in being acknowledged. So you can see here that what this means is that self-consciousness requires the other to see itself, right? That is, the only way that I can recognize myself as self-consciousness is when I recognize that another person sees me as consciousness, sees me as conscious. And it's through that recognition in the other that I recognize myself as self-conscious. So the other is necessary. So you can see here that to be self-conscious itself requires sociality. It requires others. And I have to say, I'm very taken by this idea myself. I think there's something to it. There seems to be something to the idea that in order for me to find myself, to recognize who I am, it begins with others, right? It's sort of interesting. Think about even an infant's first stages of an infant becoming conscious of the world, becoming conscious of itself, is when it becomes conscious of the other. Right? I forgot what it's called exactly, but there's a certain sort of reflex that at a certain age, I think it's in the first 8 to 20 weeks or something. I don't remember the exact date. I'm sure can post a comment and tell us. But infants, there's a certain stage in which infants, they start to mimic the face of their parents. So when the mother smiles, the infant will smile, and so on and so forth. And what's happening there is, it's a nice way of understanding this, because what's happening is the infant is looking at the mother's face and then recognizing that they're doing something, that there's another conscious entity outside of them doing something, but then they recognize themselves too. And then the infant in a non-linguistic way, begins to sort of mimic, which reveals that there's sort of kind of a development of self-consciousness, and it requires the other, right? In fact, we know that infants that are completely left alone die. So it seems like the other is really critical here. And so for Hegel, self-consciousness begins with the other. Now, consciousness has a double movement, though, right? Self-consciousness is on the one hand directed at itself, but on the other hand, it's directed at the other. You can see here there's a sort of thesis-antithesis dynamic or relation being developed. Now, so that means that self-consciousness is the result of not only seeing the other, but seeing myself too. So it's sort of both of these. Now, self-consciousness thus becomes something of a middle term between these extremes, right? And there's a great distinction Hegel makes here between being recognized versus recognizing. So you can say here that it begins with first I have to see the other, and I recognize the other, right? I'm recognizing the other, but in so doing, I recognize that I become recognized by the other, right? And you can see the language is difficult. This is one of the things. It's easy to sort of beat up on Hegel and say that Hegel's a difficult and very complicated thinker. But part of the problem here is that Hegel's trying to articulate something that's just downright difficult to say. And we can raise questions about, does that mean that maybe he's saying something that shouldn't be said? We can raise that question. But I think that he's technical and difficult to read because this is just difficult stuff. Okay? Now, that means we recognize ourselves insofar as we mutually recognize one another, right? So this is the sort of formal setup. So consciousness is simple being for itself, while the other is negatively constituted, is a negatively constituted object that is also self-conscious. I don't know if that's too helpful. I put that in there from the reading because he makes that distinction. But I just want you to sort of understand this recognition of the other. So that means that consciousness and society is bound up together. Now, as a phenomenology, one of the things that Hegel does is he tries to tell this story in terms of how the emergence of self-consciousness might emerge, and so on and so forth. And in this moment, here's what we see. Is he imagines two people coming together sort of for the first time. And both of them structurally, for reasons related to consciousness, both of these individuals are seeking to be recognized by the other person. But they're seeking that recognition simultaneously, so there's a tension, right? And the tension here is that I don't want to recognize you, I just want to be recognized by you, essentially, right? So at section 186 of the Phenomenology of Spirit, right, he says that each individual, quote, is indeed certain of its own self, but not of the other. And therefore its own self-certainty still has no truth, right? So at this initial stage, this initial confrontation, there's a sort of sense of the self, but the self doesn't have a self-certainty that has truth, right? It's still provisional. It's still only in the realm of potential. It's not actualized yet. So number 7 here is that each of these individuals seeks an abstraction of pure being for self, untethered to the other through self-presentation. And that's literally Hegel's language there, right? But what's the idea is that what I'm seeking in the other is to be recognized by the other, right? And through but I want to be untethered from the other, right? Through my own self-presentation. So through the other, I recognize myself. But once I begin to recognize myself, right, I want my self-presentation, right? It turns in on itself, if you will. So, but this is happening to both people at the same time. And so the relation of self-conscious individuals becomes a life and death struggle. He calls this the trial by death. Here, we should just even make this, well, I guess we can't. But he calls this the trial by death, right? And that is that ultimately, because that something's got to give. Someone has to submit to the other person's consciousness, right? And so what we end up having is that some sort of struggle is created. Now you can see this is that dialectical moment, right? Or it's getting close to that moment. And there's a sort of tension, and there's a trial by death, and eventually one person wins out over the other. And the person who wins becomes the Lord, right? They gain what Hegel refers to as independent consciousness, right? Because there they have a self-presentation, and the other is purely an abstraction, right? And they untether themselves, so they have an independent consciousness. The other person who loses the struggle gains a dependent consciousness. That is, they're dependent on the Lord, or at least at first they are, because they become subordinate to the Lord. And so he thinks that in society, it's interesting here, this is a very different way of understanding why certain people rise to the top, right? It's not simply because we vote and agree, it has something to do with consciousness, right? And Hegel's sketching out that story for us. So the bondsman, or the slave here, ends up with a dependent consciousness. Now, at first, this looks like the slave loses, right? But you can see what happens really is this is the formalization of that thesis antithesis moment, right? Where now we have the Lord and we have the bondsman here, right? But we're going to see there is still a synthesis coming up here. And it's actually going to involve the slave and not the Lord, interestingly enough. Whoops, let me go over here. Okay. Where are we? Okay, yeah. So these two different forms of consciousness. So you can see he's setting up in this phenomenology of thinking about society and social orders here. He's setting this up. Now, here's number 10 here. The Lord is consciousness that exists for itself, right? That's what it means to be an independent consciousness. Even though there is a mediation through the consciousness of the slave, right? It's untethered, right? And the slave, but what's interesting here is the slave, because what happens is the slave not only gets subordinated in consciousness, but then is materially subordinate to the slave, right? And what happens is that the slave becomes, the Lord becomes, interestingly enough, a sort of inversion comes where the Lord forces the slave to work for it, right? So that it can maintain its autonomy or its untethered nature here. Which looks like freedom, but what happens is that over time, the slave's consciousness begins to get bound up with work. Hegel says, quote, through work, however, the bondsman becomes conscious of what he truly is. His idea here is that the development, because remember, we're always talking about the development of consciousness. So we have this sort of thesis-antithesis moment, but the development of consciousness begins with the slave, not the Lord. Because the Lord has what the Lord wants, there is no need to develop consciousness. The necessity for the development of consciousness comes with the slave. Because the slave gets bound up with work, right? The consciousness, right? And he actually spends a lot of time talking about initially the slave exist in fear, and the development of consciousness can't come through fear. The development of consciousness has to come through work. But what happens is that the Lord and the slave essentially create habitual arrangements, and that over time the slave's relationship is less directly related to the Lord, and it's really just bound up with work that profits the Lord. But that means that the Lord becomes dependent over time on the work of the slave, and that means that a negation of negation occurs in which a new form of consciousness gets born. Because what happens is because the slave is working on the work, its consciousness is oriented accordingly, it becomes independent to some degree at some point from the Lord. Because the work is totally independent of the Lord. And this negation forces forward this process towards a new form of consciousness. And this is the dialectical moment, the negation of negation. And here's a great quote. Oops, there's a little spelling error I should fix, right? It is in this way, therefore, Hegel tells us, that self-consciousness qua worker comes to be seen in the independent being of the object of its own independence. That's section 854, right? So this is what the process of consciousness, and the opposition in consciousness is resolved or sublated in this way, where, quote, having a mind of one's own is self-will, a freedom which is still enmeshed in servitude. And we can see here that Hegel is already linking here, because with each increase in consciousness, we get an increase in freedom. But that raises the question for us, what exactly is freedom? Okay, so let's move to that question. And I'm not going to sort of belabor the text here because you can see here just trying to explain the dialectic and give sort of a quick summary of the dialectic in terms of the master-slave dialectic has already taken quite a bit of time. And remember, my goal here is to give you that overall picture. So let's ask this question: what is freedom? Well, how did Hobbes define freedom? Right? Hobbes defined freedom as not being restrained, essentially, right? And in fact, all of the social contracts essentially do. So that means we can ask this question: is freedom, right, the absence of restraint? Is freedom the absence of restraint, as the social contracts say? Now, the answer is no, it's not. And why is it not? Because if freedom were just the absence of restraint, then no one can ever be said to be free. Is that right? The idea here is that the thing about like this: if it's freedom, absence from freedom constraint, nature is constrains us physically, right? Always, right? Materially, I'm constrained. Let's see. That's why, for instance, you probably saw me just take a drink of water. I'll do it again. I take a drink of water because I'm compelled by nature to drink when I'm thirsty, to breathe when I'm suffocating, right? To eat when I'm hungry, to flee when I'm afraid. Nature constrains me physically in many ways. I have instincts, etc. And by the way, I have to be careful here because Hegel has a discussion about instincts that I don't really want to get into here. But nature constrains me. But if we just define freedom in that way, well, these natural constraints are universal to all people in all societies, which means that freedom could never be said to exist, not in its actuality. And so that means that that's a big problem, because that means that the sort of freedom that the social contract people are talking about really is not altogether clear. Right? And I think it gets better when you get to Rousseau. I think you have a better concept of freedom, but it's still fundamentally problematic in this Hegelian sense. Okay? So is there another way to talk about freedom? Well, yes. When we talk about freedom in consciousness, right? So freedom comes into existence through the taming of the will and the purification of the drives. Hegel has an almost what feels like a contrary view of freedom. Freedom is duty. Freedom is when I recognize I have a duty to act. Freedom exists when I can tame the will, the source of natural dispositions and instincts I have, and I can purify the drives I have towards things. And you know what? Although it may sound somewhat self-contradictory, I think there's a lot of truth to this idea. Because think about it. If we just say that freedom is just being unrestrained, right? I can just do what I want. There seems something problematic about that. Think about the alcoholic. The alcoholic thinks that they're free to drink at any time. But isn't the fact that they choose to drink at any time, doesn't that itself become a form of bondage to that person? Right? I think that's sort of what happens. And it seems to me that when we can control ourselves, that's when we have freedom. And remember, because consciousness is bound up with the social situation, that means that freedom is bound up there. And that through this historical emergence, what we get a process of social becoming, right? Or absolute freedom is in the process of social becoming, which means that as society increases and develops in terms of consciousness, it also develops in terms of its social arrangements. And we become freer over time. So the question isn't freedom versus non-freedom. It's really the question of the degrees of freedom in which we're talking. And the degrees of freedom are bound up with my ability or inability to control myself, to control my consciousness. And that means that it's also bound up with our inability or ability to control the social fabric, all right? So you can see here that whereas maybe the social contract people begin with the idea that politics begins in society to sort of maps itself on this social representative framework or something. You can see it's really the reverse here for Hegel. Is that historically this makes sense, right? Historically we see a process where it's a nightmare in the past. None of us would want to move back and live in the Middle Ages. And if you think that, you don't know what the Middle Ages were like. They were terrible, right? But the idea here is that it's getting better slowly over time through this slow development, which means that politics is the result of social development, not the other way around, okay? So let's here move to the next sort of point here. Let's see here. I think I'm over here. Okay. Oh, there was another spot. Sorry. Okay. So let's talk about freedom in the state. Let's see here. Let me zoom in. Okay. Now, his discussion of the state comes from his work on the philosophy of right. And in the philosophy, and really all I want to talk about now, since I'm sort of, in order to give you this framework, we've talked about I want to just sort of isolate how this dialectical process works in terms of the development of the state in politics, because that's when we start to see the criticism sort of come up, percolate, that's really related here to the state in terms of social contract theory. Now, for Hegel, right, the system of right is the development of freedom, right? What's the system for obtaining freedom and ultimately rights, okay? Now, at the first stage, there's sort of three stages in which rights, because remember, rights are related to duties, and duties are related to freedom, right? So there's this sort of kind of discussion here, but there's sort of three different stages. And when we're talking about the development of freedom, we're not taught, there's three different ways we can see it, and they can occur simultaneously in different forms, right? And they relate to consciousness, right? So the first stage here is a form of consciousness in which we have a notion of an abstract right. And this is really, he links this up with the notion of property, contract, and punishment, right? And in particular, he really focuses on property and contract. You can see he's directly thinking of these contract theorists here, especially Locke, who puts property as the central sort of ingredient. But for Hegel, this is this very bare form this is the very first stage. And at this stage, we can't even properly say that there's such a thing as freedom, right? Because in this way, it's too preliminary, right? It's really the second stage here, what he calls the stage of morality or the ethical stage, that we see an increased development in terms of consciousness, right? Where we actually can talk about freedom as actually coming into existence. Now, morality is this stage where we talk about, and think about here in terms of we talk about rights, right? Think of, I have a right to my property, or you signed a contract, that's the right, right? And think of the sort of social arrangement you have in that situation, right? And that's the sort of arrangement that the Hobbes and Locke are identifying with the entire state itself. And there seems to be more to it than that. Because if we're talking about freedom, and freedom is about the recognition of duty, then that means there's more to it than this, because simply knowing that you have property doesn't really give me much to go on in terms of duty, right? It means maybe I have a duty to respect that, but that's pretty minimal. The second stage here related to consciousness is much better because it focuses on the interior subjectivity that we normally and typically associate with morality and ethics, right? We normally think that ethics is when I have to sort of sit and think about what's right for me to do, right? Should I allow, or should I prompt my girlfriend or my wife to have an abortion, right? That's an interior sort of discussion I have to have with myself. It definitely requires a form of self-consciousness, right? And this is the type of ethics and morality that, for instance, Kant talks about. So Hegel is also thinking about his particular version of philosophy that he's sort of interested in addressing here. But in the second stage, we can talk about freedom. The development of freedom can exist here. But we should recognize that the sort of social form of it isn't like where we have contracts with each other. It's more akin to the spirit of a family, right? It's more akin, think about when I recognize that I have a moral duty to treat others in such a way, with respect, for instance, I have to recognize that they have value as beings in their own sake, for their own right, which means that my relationship is not sort of one of give and take, one of exchange. My relationship is rather one as compatriots, right? Because remember, it's through the other here that I recognize myself. So that means that he says the sort of social arrangement is much more communal, actually. You can see sort of a slight reference or sort of thought here to Rousseau to some extent, right? Even though we have to be careful because I won't want you to think that they're directly related, at least not explicitly. Now, but it means at this stage that's when we begin to develop shared institutions. And Hegel makes this distinction between civil society and the state, right? We've actually seen, he's not the first person to make this distinction, we've seen it before. But the idea here is that civil society is the development of these shared institutions that emerge from this second stage, right? And that stage 3 here is the state in its proper form. And the state is when ultimately we move from just having shared institutions, right? These are not obviously the examples he gives, but having the YMCA, churches, and things like this. These are shared institutions to actually formalizing these duties universally across the entire society, right? And this is when we can talk about freedom being fully realized. But the real thing here is that for Hegel, the state is more than a contract. Why? Contracts, of course, number one, are up here in the first stage. But there's another issue. And that's the issue that the contracts are always contingent, right? The idea of being free in a contract means that I can freely end the contract too, right? At least insofar as I can fulfill it, right? So, but you can see here that contracts are contingent upon me wanting some sort of end, right? Think about it. The only way I ever enter into a contract is if that contract is instrumentally valuable to me in some way. That is, if that contract, meets a need that I have, right? But what happens, but that means that the contract is contingent on the need. What if I don't need that need any longer? That means the contract becomes useless. So you can see here that he wants to say that the state is actually much more important than that. So he's not actually devaluing the state. From Hegel's perspective, he's actually articulating the utter cruciality, the crucial nature here of the state. Because it's within the state that freedom gets fully realized, because we recognize we fully tame the will, if you will. The social collective will and these sorts of drives get tamed. The state is a form of absolute freedom, and the consciousness becomes sort of free. Absolute consciousness emerges. And so Hegel's fuller idea here is that means that through the state and through social institutions, ultimately, Geist is coming into consciousness as well. Okay? Now, I want to move here to really some two key passages that I think are really helpful, and I really want to sort of point our attention to. So let's look at the first one here. Right? Whoops. And this comes in section 257 at the very end of the system of right. And this is from section 3 when he talks about the state, right? Quote, "The state is the actuality of the ethical idea, the ethical spirit as substantial will manifest and clear to itself, which thinks and knows itself and implements what it knows so far as it knows it," right? So the state is the actuality of ethics, ultimately, right? And it's the development of in implementation of what is known insofar as it is known. Now, it has the immediate existence in custom and its mediate existence in the self-consciousness of the individual. So you can see here that it exists in terms of its immediate sort of form, in terms of custom. But its mediating form of existence is self-consciousness of each individual. In the individual's knowledge and activity, just as self-consciousness, by virtue of its disposition, has its substantial freedom. I don't know why there's a 9 there. Okay. Has its substantial freedom in the state as its essence, its end, and the product of its activity. Now, I'm hoping that, given what I've said so far in this video, you can understand what this passage is referring to and what he means when he defines the state, because this is ultimately what the state is. And you can see it's apples and oranges compared to what we saw in social contract theory. Now, let's move here to another passage that I think is equally important and interesting. I love spell check when I see these sorts of problems. Okay, let me read it to you. This is actually from the addition to section 268, edition H. It's located in your book on, I guess it's page 875. Okay, quote, "They trust that the state will continue to exist and the particular interest can be fulfilled within it alone. But habit blinds us to the basis of our entire existence." You can imagine right here, he's talking to the social contract theorist, right? They trust that the state will continue to exist and that the particular interest can be fulfilled within it alone. And that actually we all sort of generally think that. But habit blinds us to the basis of our entire existence. It does not occur to someone who walks the streets in safety at night that this might be otherwise, for this habit of safety has become second nature, and we scarcely stop to think that it is solely the effect of particular institutions. Representational thought. Well, let me actually pause and say something about this. Let me read that again. It doesn't occur to someone who walks the street in safety at night that this might be otherwise, for this habit of safety has become second nature, and we scarcely stop to think of it. That it's solely the effect of particular institutions, right? Here's the idea, is that our society, right, the state in which we exist in the United States, right, has created a certain sort of social form of life, a paradigm, in which it almost seems to us that this is just how it should naturally be, because we've become so accustomed to have it. Right? And he thinks that these people who are interested in defending representational thought or representational democracy here, they imagine that the state is held together by force, right? Isn't that what Hobbes thinks, right? Hobbes thinks that ultimately the Leviathan rules through force, right? And even this very notion that the laws have to be executed through force. The very breakdown of the government in terms of legislative and executive, the executive is the power of force, reveals that representational government, or at least political thought, always maintains this idea. Now, but that's not what holds us together. It's not through the threat of me killing you that ultimately creates a society that's stable. What holds it together here is what Hegel says is simply the basic sense of order which everyone possesses. And where does that sort of sense of order we get come from? It comes from the form of consciousness that results from, well, this historical process. Okay? So you can see here that the real critical things that Hegel introduces here in terms of trying to evaluate the importance of him in terms of social and political philosophy is that Hegel articulates, number one, he articulates a very different story in terms of the development of society. And which means that when we link up his discussion of consciousness, the state, and the dialectic, we see a radically different story, such that I think is much richer than the social contract tradition. Because the social contract tradition, well, it just seems to actually sort of be a little too reductive and abstract. Here, Hegel provides us something that is fabulously larger. Now, the question, though, is it true? And I'll leave that question to you to contemplate and for you to think about as you read through and sort of explore Hegel's ideas. But you will see that this notion, this Hegel's Hegel's rearrangement of the question from politics to society becomes really quite pivotal, and you can even have already seen it in the anarchism of Kropotkin to some extent. But anyway, next week, in our next video, we'll talk about Marx and how Marx is going to sort of pull this dialectic and this discussion of freedom and the state, and he's going to pull this discussion of consciousness, and he's going to turn it upside down. He's going to move it from idealism to materialism, and that's when we'll be able to actually articulate some of the sort of trends that I know some of you are interested in thinking about. Okay, thank you guys for watching the video. I hope this is helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys online. Okay, bye.